And good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming on this online session. I rather would have liked to have given this as a live talk from the shore, but with the technological problems, shall we say, and the fact that it's blowing a gale outside, it's probably just as well to do this indoors. But anyway, what I've done is to prepare a short presentation on a big subject, and so I'll just start this. There we are. Seaweeds in rock pools is my topic, and the reason I chose this title was that really anyone wanting to study seaweeds and start studying seaweeds, then rock pools are probably the best habitat to do it. They're accessible to everyone. We find them all around the rocky coasts of Britain, and they're a treasure trove of seaweed species. So I'd like to start really on the land, which is how you'd approach the shore. And there's a zone we call the splash zone, where the sea doesn't actually reach, the tide doesn't actually cover, but it gets wave splash. It'll also get a lot of input from the land in terms of runoff and rain, etc. And here the rock pools are pretty barren and can get very stagnant in the summertime. And there's not much in the way of life, seaweed or otherwise. But there are a few species that can thrive in these pools, particularly some of the green algae. We have here the gutweed, Ulva intestinalis, and branched greenweed, Cladophora sericea. Both of these specialize in living in these very changeable habitats, and they can survive the changes in salinity and temperature and oxygen levels, etc., that goes with this habitat. In this picture, you can see these little air bubbles. The tubular gutweed gets air bubbles within the fronds, and you can see the bubbles forming on the outside of the Cladophora. And if you put your hand in these pools in the summer, you'll see they fizz a bit like lemonade, and that's all the oxygen that's being given off coming to the surface. They're photosynthesizing like mad and giving off oxygen. These pools, as I say, they can get pretty stagnant, and in summer, when there's a lot of evaporation, the pools can actually dry out and all the seaweeds will appear dead or dying around the edges of the pool. Going down the beach a little bit to the upper shore, here we have a habitat that's covered by the sea, but only by spring tides, 1 week in every 2. So for 7 days at a time, they can be out of water completely and exposed to changes in salinity, temperature, etc., that you get in the air. The upper shore pools have got more species than the splash zone pools, but aren't particularly rich. In this pool, you can see typical communities that we find in these upper shore rock pools. The rock itself is covered in a sort of a pink paint, and these are coralline seaweeds, or pink paint weeds, as we give them as a common name. And they coat the rock, and other species, and they can survive in these conditions. And they're grazed by limpets, which stop other species living here. So it's a great competitive advantage to the pink paintweeds here. You can't really see the limpets because they're covered in seaweed, in that gutweed, Enteromorpha intestinalis or Ulva intestinalis. The limpets are grazing the seaweed everywhere except on the backs of each other. So there we are. We go down the beach to the middle shore, and here we have a lot more different species. The middle shore habitat is covered by the sea every day, covered and uncovered by the tides every day. and particularly the deeper pools have got a rich variety of species. I'm not going to flood you with species names today because it'll just be in one ear and out the other. The best way to learn these species is to go and look for yourselves and find them and identify them. All come on one of our courses that we run at the MBA. But here are a few of the fantastic growth forms that we find. We've got the beautiful straggleweed, Gelidium pulchellum, and false eyelash weed, Caliblepharis jubata at the bottom left. The common coral weed, Corallina officinalis, which I'll be telling you more about later. Pale pincer weed, Ceramium pallidum, and there are lots of other Ceramium species. And Dumont's tubular weed, Dumontia contorta. A lot of these seaweed names, we've given them common names, but it's a good thing to learn the Latin names. And we've tried to derive the common names from the Latin names wherever possible. For example, Dumont's tubular weed. Dumont, this seaweed was named after a phycologist called Dumont. Okay, well, going down to the lower shore. Well, we never get enough time to study seaweeds in the lower shore. It's only uncovered for short periods of time and only during spring tides, 1 week in every 2. But it's here that you find the biggest variety of seaweeds. The environment here is pretty steady and it's not affected by the influx of fresh water or extremes of temperature like higher up the beach. We have species such as kelps and a lot of other different seaweed species, lots of different red seaweeds and brown seaweeds. Here are a few of them. We've got sea oak, Elidris siliquosa, oarweed in the background there, Laminaria digitata, and the sorac, Fucus serratus. But I'm going to go back up the beach a minute and look at this coralline seaweed, or crustose corallines as we often call them. They're very difficult to identify, but they're one of the most common species that we get in rock pools and in fact in the shallow seas around our coast. They're normally overlooked and this is rather unfair. So I wanted to just give you 5 interesting facts about coralline seaweeds. So here we go. They're a very old group of seaweeds. In fact, fossils date back approximately 360 million years. They incorporate calcium carbonate from the seawater into their thallus, and they're hard and very robust seaweeds. So they can live in very extreme environments, subject to wave action. They can tolerate grazing pressure. Very few other things eat them. And they're the slowest growing marine algae and possibly the longest living marine organisms, with some having been estimated to be about 700 years old. There's a rock pool in Pembrokeshire that a friend of mine, Sue Scott, found. It's in a rock pool in a cave halfway up a cliff, and in it there was some very thick growths of this crustose coralline seaweed, and it was aged to be 400 years old. These seaweeds probably cover more substratum than any other group of organisms in shallow seas and are of great ecological importance. Particularly in the tropics, they're described as the glue that consolidates and stabilizes coral reefs and releases chemicals that attract the settlement of coral larvae. They're resistant to grazing and have a positive relationship with herbivores, as they often thrive in grazed habitats, such as the example I gave you before with rock pools grazed by limpets. Other coralline algae include what we call the geniculate corallines. These are closely related, but they're erect upright growths. They're called geniculate because of they're jointed, like the joints in a knee. That's how they were described. And here in the southwest, we've got 3 species of these geniculate corallines. We've got the common Corallina officinalis, and more recently described by my colleague Juliette Brody is Corallina caespitosa. This tends to live more around the edges of the pools, and so does Alissolanda elongata on the right there. Sometimes when you look in rock pools, you'll see that the seaweeds tend to shine and shimmer different colours. And I want to talk a little bit about this because there's been some recent research which has been investigating actually how this happens and why it might happen. And one of our commonest seaweeds in pools is the Irish moss, Chondrus crispus. And in summer, we can see that it can shimmer and shine. So here's a little bit of video that I took just to show this. At the tips of the fronds, we can see this sort of blue metallic sheen. Now you don't get this out on the open rock, only in pools, and it's only right at the tip of the seaweed. Here's a paper by Chandler et al., which includes Juliette, and it explores the subject of iridescence in seaweeds, or what they call structural colour in seaweeds. And what happens is that the light is reflected and refracted by the outer tissues of the seaweed, and the appearance to us is of a metallic blue sheen. And the mechanism by which this occurs is actually little layers of, you can see on number A here on the top left, just go back, they're layers of protein and carbohydrates, polysaccharides, and as the light travels through those, it's reflected back as blue light. And number D at the bottom there shows an image down a microscope of this light coming back reflected as a blue. People have wondered why this occurs. Now we do get these fluorescent colours in a lot of organisms on land, such as insects and birds and flowers. In flowers, the iridescence in flowers guides insects which are pollinating, and in animals such as insects, glowworms for example, the light produced is used as an attractant for mates. But in seaweeds, we don't think this is the case. The light only, the shimmering blue light only appears right at the tips of the seaweeds, and this is where the reproductive structures are formed for gametes. And it's thought that the light actually, that these layers which reflect the light are actually protecting the DNA in the gametes from ultraviolet light, which is why they only occur in the summer when the seaweeds are reproducing. And they only occur in pools because these layers don't tend to work when the seaweeds are out on the open rock. This is an example of Irish moss or Chondrus crispus, which is in very shallow water, exposed to the air during summer, and all the pigments are bleached out. And deeper down in the pool, this wouldn't happen, and the seaweeds would be able to reproduce and survive properly. Okay, another spectacular seaweed that we have is the bushy rainbow wrack, Carpodesmia tamariscifolia. Now, I've dropped this new name in here, Carpodesmia. It used to be called Cystocera tamariscifolia, but the classification has now been updated and changed. But this plant, it's the most amazing sort of blue colour, very surreal. It's a brown seaweed, but it looks blue when it's iridescing. Studies have shown that, again, the light is reflected and refracted and comes back at us as blue light. But instead of these layers of protein and carbohydrate, we have iridescent bodies produced within the cells, and these act to reflect the light. On the left here is a electron micrograph showing this, and on the right, a view down a microscope of the effect of this reflection. Other brown seaweeds and red seaweeds show this. Here we have another one we can find in rock pools, Dictyota dichotoma, the brown fanweed. Can you see the yellowish tinge on the tips? Well, that's again caused by these bodies inside the cells. And a newcomer to our coast, the blue-fringed fanweed, Dictyota cyanelloma, and this produces a sort of blue light rather than the yellow light. And again, it's thought that because the reproductive bodies are found around the tips and edges of the fronds, that the DNA is protected by reflecting this light. Okay, I mean, these seaweeds are lovely to look at. And here we have the Carpodesmia tamariscifolia on a rock, and below it another beautiful seaweed, which again shines in the light, called the peacock's tail, Podaina pavonica. Actually, this is a brown seaweed that incorporates calcium carbonate into its skeleton. And it's very tempting to pick these seaweeds. You go to a rock pool, oh, fantastic, and you go and pick some. But don't, because the rainbow wrack is a very long-lived, slow-growing species. If you take it out of a pool, you might be destroying years of growth, and it may not come back. And this is what happens in Pembrokeshire. The map here shows the Dale Peninsula on the north side of Milford Haven, and this was taken from a publication called The Seaweeds of Dale by Ifian Jones and Williams, and published in 1966. And rainbow wrack at that time was known from the shores around the Dale Peninsula, where I've put the red dots. Those are places where it was found. But now we don't find any of it. We don't find, and in the past there have been records of Podaina pavonica, but that too is not there. Why it's not there, we don't know, but it's a bit suspicious that this is that these shores are around a field studies centre where there's a lot of collecting. Okay, well, I can't talk about seaweeds in rock pools without talking about some of the fascinating life cycles. In fact, really to understand the seaweeds you're seeing, you need to know a little bit about the life cycles. They're also very useful for identifying seaweeds. And I'd like to start with one of the common seaweeds that we find in the early summer, and that's the chipolata weed, Scytosiphon lomentaria. And here you can see it growing in a pool. It's constricted at intervals, hence this name, the chipolata weed. But it's also grows as a crust on rocks. And it's only fairly recently we've realized that the chipolata weed and this brown crust are actually the same thing. They're just different parts of the life cycle. If I go back here, the filamentous stage, or the erect stage, is only produced during short day lengths and at low temperatures, which is why it tends to be fine. It grows in the spring and then it disappears in the summer. Whereas the crust here likes warm temperatures and long days and will tend to grow, the plants develop into this in the summer. And if we look at this diagram of the life cycle taken from a recent publication, and I'll be giving you a reference list at the end of this, so you can look these things up if you like to. But here we have A and B, a male and female erect plants, which produce male and female gametes that will fuse to form a zygote, which will eventually settle. And if it's long day lengths and warm temperatures, it'll grow into a crust like the one you saw in this previous photo. If it's short day lengths and cold temperatures, it'll reproduce and grow more erect fronds. But if it grows into a crust and it overwinters, then in the spring, when it produces gametes again, these will grow into male and female erect plants. So it's got this life cycle that is adapted for the varied conditions that are found in rock pools. So now I've introduced you to the complexity of life cycles. Let's go a stage further with what's called the Polysiphonia type life cycle. And a lot of the red seaweeds have got this life cycle. Okay, I'm illustrating this with a very common species that we find called the black siphonweed, Polysiphonia fucoides. So let's start off with male and female gametophyte plants, as we call them. These are, for those of you who've done a bit of A-level biology or even O-level biology, you'll probably understand the terms mitosis and meiosis and haploid and diploid. Well, these are haploid plants. They've got half the number of chromosomes. And the male and the females grow as haploid individuals. The male plants produce sperm and the female plants produce eggs in structures called sister carps. A sister carp develops into a structure called a carpogonium, which has got a long hair-like trichogyne onto which sperm can attach when released into the seawater, and then fertilization occurs. The fertilized carpogonium then has got double the number of chromosomes, half from the female plant, half from the male plant. And we have this strange situation of this fertilized, what we call carposporophyte, great names, but basically this is a diploid plant growing on the haploid female plant. This will then produce, by mitosis, it will produce microscopic carpospores, and these are released into the seawater and will germinate as what's called a tetrasporophyte, which is a diploid plant. And these are virtually indistinguishable from the male and female haploid plants that we saw at the beginning, but they've got double the number of chromosomes. And in their life cycle, they will produce, by mitosis again, they will produce tetrasporangia, which then by meiosis will produce haploid tetraspores, which will then grow into male and female plants, separate male and female plants. So you've got this amazing life cycle where we alternate between haploid and diploid forms, and then we have this strange carposporophyte somewhere in the mix as well. Now, this is a complex life cycle. I hope I've made it simple, but within seaweeds, the green, the browns and the reds, they have a whole variety of different life cycles that will give them adaptations to the environments in which they're found. We don't fully understand everything about these life cycles and why they happen. But with some seaweeds, we never get the male and females being found. They just survive as populations as tetrasporophytes. And maybe when certain conditions are met, they will produce the male and female plants. Well, no talk on rock pool species is complete without mentioning the subject of non-native species. We do have quite a lot of non-native species in our rock pools, in our flora, in our marine flora. A lot of these have been introduced via oysters that have come from Japan and are actually Japanese species, where Japan has temperate waters and the species can grow and thrive in our temperate Atlantic seas. On the left here, there's one of the biggest and commonest. It's the wireweed Sargassum muticum. And this species is really quite a dominant species, and it can actually completely cover the surface of pools in summer. And it will have caused some sort of change in the environment for our native species. But it's so widespread now around really the whole of the UK coast. There's no controlling it now. And it's part of our flora, really. On the right here is a more recent introduction, but again, this has spread right around our coasts. Devil's tongueweed, Gratelupia chiru. Rather a sinister name, but a pretty sort of benign seaweed, really. It's gelatinous and slippery, and it's most common in marinas, where boats have travelled from A to B around our coast and taken it with them. And, of course, where you've got oyster farms, you'll find Gratelupia chiru. Okay, well, that's, if you like, a lightning tour of rock pools. We also have animals, which I've rather ignored in this talk, but animals normally get all the limelight. So don't ignore them. Sorry, ignore the animals and go and look at the seaweeds. That's my advice. Okay, how do you get into seaweeds? If you're not used to looking at seaweeds, there can be a bit of a difficult subject to get into, but we have produced a book, and with my co-authors Juliette Brodie, Christine Maggs, and Anne. It's called The Sea Search Guide to Seaweeds of Britain and Ireland, and here we've got lots of pictures, lots of easy to read text, and that's a good way if you're starting looking at seaweeds. And even if you're not, hopefully we've provided lots of pictures donated by lots of different people, which will help you identify seaweeds. There's also the British Phycological Society have produced this series of books called Seaweeds of the British Isles, and they're essential for any serious seaweed identification. They're available online. Not many bookstops stock them, but they're a great series, but they're really written in a fairly academic, complex way. So it's good if you're starting to have some basic books, but then go on to these if you really want to get into your seaweeds. They're fantastic pieces of work. Online, we have AlgaeBase, which is a great resource of information, and it's a good way to be able to look up seaweeds. There's lots of pictures, again, donated by different people, and it's run by Mike Ryrie in Ireland, and it's a fantastic resource. It'll give you references to literature if you want to find out more about particular species. And a good general read about the rocky shore is produced by my friends John Archer Thompson and Julian Cremona. It's a recent publication. It's a lovely book, lots of great photos, and there's a good chapter on rock pools and seaweeds. And anyone who develops an interest in seaweeds, a must is to join the British Phycological Society. It's very cheap to join, especially if you're a student, and even if you're not, I think it's less than £20 a year, and it's a great way to keep up to date. There's information on meetings, training, grants for students, and it produces a sort of magazine called The Phycologist and the journal, the European Journal of Phycology, and more recently a new applied journal of phycology. Identification courses. The best way to learn is to come and join a group and learn about seaweeds. Come on a course. And Christine Maggs and myself run an annual course at the MBA in association with the British Phycological Society. We keep the costs right down. It's not a profit-making course, and there are grants for students who want to come. So this is a good one to come on. Hopefully we can be doing this again as normal when we get over our current crisis. And so I'm looking forward to next year. Okay, a few references, particularly where I've borrowed diagrams, etc., for you to, so if you want to learn more about them, you can find these. And I'd like to thank my colleagues and co-authors who have helped me in the past and who I work with closely, Juliet Brodie, Anne Bunker, Christine Maggs, and also to John Parr and Alexandra Street at the MBA who've put this on. Okay.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much. Thanks for a fascinating talk. There's a bit of a masterclass in seaweeds, I think. So a brilliant talk, and we'll be putting that up on YouTube. So I think there'll be lots of interest from other students coming along wanting to look at it, either MBA students or otherwise. We've had a few questions, so I'll go through those if that's all right. So
I'll do my best.
Okay. So Harry, very early on, was saying it's very important. Seaweeds are very important, but a lot of people don't find them of interest, or they're not important. What do you say to that? The importance of seaweeds.
The importance of seaweeds. Well, the sea covers 90% of the surface of the earth, and the plants in the sea are largely marine algae, whether they're planktonic and live in the oceans, or whether they're attached to the rocks and the substrata around our coast. But they're extremely important as regulators of climate, as food in the food chains. They're the primary producers in the sea. So their importance is beyond doubt.
Good. I think Harry agrees, and I think we should, they're important enough. So Keith asked a question about common names, which is something that comes up a lot, I know. So Keith is in favour of common names, and the notes the names are more long-lived than scientific names. But there are two types of sea oak. What to do?
What to do? I know. When we produced the guide, the common names were a difficult one to navigate. Where there weren't any common names, we tried to translate the Latin into or the Greek, and get some meaning. Sometimes it was very difficult. Um, but if we came across established common names, we tried to use them. And yeah, I think the sea oak thing needs sorting out. So anyone who's got because we've got this red seaweed, rather beautiful red seaweed, which looks just like an oak leaf, called Phycodrus rubens. And then we've got the other sea oak, Helidra siliquosa, which to me doesn't look like oak at all, maybe apart from the browny colour. But maybe we need to rename that one. So maybe ideas on postcards, please.
So with common names, you in your publications sort of review them, I guess. Are there any other sort of almanacs of common names and their usage?
Not really. I mean, some of the sort of classic seaweed texts, I think going back to the 1800s, like I think if I'm right, Lightfoot, if I'm correct. Anyway, some of these texts have got common names. There's Newton's seaweed, which was a very popular, if you like, the first popular seaweed book produced in the 1930s. Has got translations of the Latin, which you can form common names from. But really, there's no real almanac of common names.
No.
And they've changed over time. I mean, some of the Lightfoot names we discarded because didn't really have any meaning today.
Yeah, okay, thank you for that. The question from Jan about, you mentioned that coralline seaweeds are one of the oldest seaweeds, but you didn't mention cyanobacteria. And would like that mentioned. What about cyanobacteria and strombolites? Are these older?
Yes, they are. I don't know, 500, 600 million years. I mean, the first fossils were of cyanobacteria, and so yes, they're the oldest. So I beg your pardon. I'm just trying to, but we do find, of course, we find cyanobacteria on the shore. But they're a fantastic group, but they're quite specialised, especially when you try to identify them. So I sort of rather glossed over those. I'm sorry.
No, I'm sure that's absolutely fine. There was a question which I've just lost about. So the harpoon weed has become much more abundant in southwest England than it ever was when it was first discovered. Do you think that the increased abundance is an outcome of warming, and are good years correlated with sunny summers?
Yeah, this is, when I talked about the chipolata weed, the Scytosiphon, and how it varies its growth form depending on day length and temperature. Well, a similar sort of mechanism occurs with the harpoon weed, and it tends to only grow these gametophytes, the harpoon-like growth form during warm temperatures and long day lengths, and you need that combination. And as you go around the coast, you do actually find the tetrasporophyte, which is a tiny little fluffy ball form of the harpoon weed. It's named Falkenbergia, the Falkenbergia stage. And you find that all around our coasts. But further north, it's unusual to find the harpoon, the gametophytes, which are the harpoon form. But you do. We found some up in the Sound of Barra, in the Hebrides. But there you do get some quite warm currents coming up there in the summer, and localized warming. So it could well be that the increase in this seaweed, in the gametophyte form of it around the coast, is correlated with global warming, and that would be an interesting thing to monitor over time.
Sure. Okay. And also possibly linked to that is the sort of vulnerability of rock pools. You mentioned Wrack in Pembrokeshire disappearing, maybe due to over sampling, rock pools presumably are very vulnerable to impact in terms of trampling and people wading through.
Yeah, it's there's a fine dividing line between getting support for and interest in the general public in any group of whether it's animals or plants, and the disturbing and destroying of habitats. And there's a bit of a worry now in that foraging has become a very popular pastime, and people are realizing the health benefits that you can get from eating seaweed products, and a lot of people are interested in picking them and taking them home and eating them and drying them. And I think you have to be very careful. I would say never pick from conservation areas, and find out whether you're in a conservation area before you start picking. Be careful what you pick. Yeah, I think it is a potential worry, especially in a sort of population dense island like ourselves. I think maybe take small samples if you need to, but massive collecting is not encouraged.
No. Okay. Thank you. And a final question was on the shimmering seaweeds. Can the seaweeds that shimmered different colours be in any way correlated with biofluorescence? And that's from Luca.
No, because biofluorescence is, if I'm right, is an active sort of process in the cells to produce light, whereas this is the reflecting of light. So if you went and looked in the dark, you wouldn't see them shimmering in the dark. It's only when there's light shining on them.
Fantastic, and lots of thank yous for the talk. Lots of great talk, by the way, from various people. I'm sure Gerald will agree, who's appeared on the screen. But yeah, so
Gerald. Hello, Gerald.
Good morning, Francis.
Nice to see you.
So leads me to say thank you, Francis, for that talk. Very, very good, and as I say, a masterclass in seaweed. So we'll put this up on YouTube now, or later today, hopefully. But yes, thank you from all of us for that talk. I'll just share my screen now to say that the next talk is from Scott, and the title on that is Blue Carbon, the Role of Coastal Salt Marshes in Climate Change Mitigation. So that's an up-and-coming talk. That'll be on Thursday, the 23rd of July. So a Thursday rather than a Monday, and we're generally moving these talks to later in the week. So try and stop a sharp start to the week. So that will be Scott talking on Thursday, the 23rd of July. And lastly, to say thank you all for joining us. Thanks for listening. The MBA, like British Phycological Society, is a membership organisation. We're a global community, and we're very keen that people join that community and become members of the MBA. And join in with events like this. So please do visit the website and spread the word if you think people should be joining the MBA. So a global community. So with that, I'll thank Francis again, and everybody, thank you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you for joining me.